The smell of the Ardennes was the first thing Mara Voss had learned to love about deep space, and the last thing she expected to miss when she died. It was not a romantic smell. Nothing about it invited poetry. The recycled air carried a faint metallic undertone, something like old pennies left in a coat pocket layered over the particular staleness of a vessel that had been sealed and resealed so many times that the atmosphere itself seemed tired. There was always a ghost of coffee near the galley junction, not because anyone was brewing it, but because the ventilation system had been impregnated with the habit of it after 9 years. Sometimes, near Bay 3, she caught a thread of something that reminded her of the machine shop in her father's garage in Freiburg cutting oil and hot metal, and the particular silence of a man working alone, not lonely, just focused. She was 47 years old, and she had spent 11 of those years aboard vessels like this one, and she knew what her ship smelled like the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. It was not background noise. It was information. Mara Voss was a systems integration specialist, grade 7, contracted to the Terran Survey Corps. Her formal job, the one listed on her personnel file and her transit documents, and the single brief biography that appeared on the TSC internal directory, was the maintenance and optimization of long-range habitat platforms. What that meant in practice was that she was the person who kept things from breaking in places where nothing was supposed to break, because there was no one coming to fix it if it did. She had degrees in mechanical engineering and environmental systems management. She had a certification in emergency medical response that was 4 years old and still valid, mostly because the tests hadn't changed. She spoke German and English and functional Mandarin, the last picked up over 3 deployments alongside a crew chief from Chengdu named Bo who had taught her to curse with remarkable specificity. She was not a soldier. She had never been a soldier. The TSC issued her a sidearm at the start of each deployment, and she kept it locked in a drawer under her bunk, and had never once fired it in anything but the mandated annual qualification, which she passed with mediocre scores and no particular embarrassment about that. What she was, genuinely and without false modesty, was one of the best habitat engineers in the Corps. She had a gift for systems thinking, for holding the entire architecture of a station or a ship in her head simultaneously and sensing, the way some people sense weather, where the stress was accumulating, where something was about to give. She had extended the operational life of Outpost Kerensky by 19 months on a shoestring of spare parts and repurposed paneling. She had jury-rigged an atmospheric processor on the Meridian platform using components from a water recycler, and a very creative interpretation of the technical manual. Her supervisor, a compact man named Holloway who ran the TSC's Deep Range division from an office in Nairobi, had once described her in a performance review as aggressively competent, and she had taken it as the highest compliment of her professional life. She was thinking about her daughter when the first alarm sounded. Inez was 23 now, living in Hamburg, finishing a master's degree in environmental law. They had video called 4 days ago, 4 days by ship time, which was running slightly different from Earth standard thanks to relativistic drift, and Inez had been wearing a blue sweater that Mara recognized as one she'd bought for herself 15 years ago. The kind of migration of clothing that happened between mothers and daughters so naturally that neither of them had commented on it. Inez had been frustrated. There was a professor who didn't take her seriously, something about her thesis framing. She'd talked quickly, hands moving, and Mara had watched her and thought, "You got that from me, that thing with your hands." She'd thought, "When did you become someone I would want to know, even if you weren't mine?" She had been writing a follow-up message when the alarm sounded. She'd gotten as far as, "Inez, I've been thinking about what you said about the framing question. I think you're right that the panel is approaching it wrong, and here's why." The alarm was the proximity sensor on the outer hull array, not the general alert klaxon that was reserved for hull breaches, atmospheric failures, the category of emergency that required immediate physical action. This was the quieter alarm, the one that lived in the monitoring station at the far end of the main operations bay, the one that said, "Something is out there that shouldn't be." The Ardennes was not a combat vessel. It was a Type 7 habitat platform tender, a mid-sized support ship, whose entire purpose was to carry equipment and personnel to remote survey stations and then hold position nearby while the work was done, available for resupply and emergency extraction. It had thrusters capable of respectable transit speeds but no particular maneuverability, a hull designed for durability rather than stealth, and a defensive suite that had been described in the procurement documentation as deterrent class, which was the diplomatic language for adequate to discourage opportunistic piracy, but not much else. It was currently stationed 12 kilometers from Survey Platform Kilo 7, which sat at the outer edge of the Vanthari Nebula. Mara set down her stylus and walked to the monitoring station. The Vanthari Nebula was not a place where ships went voluntarily. That was not hyperbole or rumor. It was a simple observational fact that had accumulated over approximately 60 years of multi-species contact and exploration. The Keth, who were the first spacefaring species humanity had encountered, had a phrase for it that translated roughly as the place where signals die. The Sauri, who were older than the Keth and generally less dramatic about things, had simply designated the entire region a navigational exclusion zone and had not offered any further explanation, which was, if you understood the Sauri, more alarming than a detailed warning would have been. The Vanthari was a stellar nursery, a dense cloud of gas and dust roughly 4 light-years across, shot through with the violent radiation of protostars and the complex magnetic fields that formed when young suns began throwing their weight around. Communications inside the nebula were difficult. Sensors were unreliable. Ships that ventured too deep had reported instrument failures that ranged from minor annoyances to catastrophic navigational errors. None of that was why other species stayed away. They stayed away because of what lived there. No one had ever gotten a good look. The Keth had lost 2 survey ships in the outer layers, lost them not to collision or radiation, but to pursuit, something that had chased them out of the nebula and back into clear space, and whatever it was had stopped at the boundary as though there were a fence. The Sauri had apparently encountered them as well, generations ago, and had made whatever calculation the Sauri made about such things, and concluded that whatever was in the nebula was best left in it. Humanity, characteristically, had decided to survey the outer edge anyway. Mara had been on 3 rotations at Kilo 7. She knew the nebula the way she knew her ship, its rhythms, its patterns of interference, the way the gas clouds caught the light of the protostars and threw it in colors that had no names in any terrestrial language. She had learned to interpret the sensor ghosts that the environment produced, the false returns and the instrument noise, and the occasional anomalous reading that turned out to be nothing but atmospheric density variation. This reading was not nothing. It was moving. She stood at the monitoring station and looked at the data for a long moment without touching anything, just processing. The object or objects, the resolution wasn't good enough to distinguish clearly, was approximately 300 kilometers out, bearing 270 relative to the Ardennes' current orientation. It had emerged from the nebula boundary approximately 40 minutes ago, which meant it had been sitting in there, just inside the edge before that. The thermal signature was suppressed, which was not a natural phenomenon. Things that suppressed their thermal signatures were doing it on purpose. She ran the standard scan enhancement and got back the same result, slightly clearer. 2 distinct masses, moving in a loose formation, thermal signature actively managed, and a faint electromagnetic emission profile that did not match any cataloged vessel type in the TSC database. Not human, not Keth, not Sauri, not any of the 4 other species humanity had made contact with in the last 4 decades. Something new, or something old that had never been cataloged because every other species that encountered it had run. Mara stood there in the quiet hum of the operations bay, the Ardennes making its familiar sounds around her, the ventilation cycling, the distant percussion of the water recirculation system, the faint creak that came from the forward bulkhead during thermal expansion, and she did the methodical thing. She ran diagnostics on the sensor array. She checked for interference patterns that might cause false readings. She pulled up the last 6 hours of sensor log and looked for precursor data that might indicate a progressive sensor failure. Everything checked out. The sensors were working. The data was real. She opened a channel to survey platform Kilo 7. Kilo 7, this is Ardennes. Dr. Chen, I need you on comms. A pause. The platform's automated systems acknowledged the transmission. Another pause longer. Ardennes, this is Chen. Dr. Renata Chen was the survey team lead, a xenobiologist from Sao Paulo who had spent 20 years in deep-range research and had, in Mara's experience, a very low threshold for what she considered an emergency. What's up, Voss? I'm reading 2 unidentified signatures at 300 kilometers, bearing 270, emerged from the Nebula boundary approximately 40 minutes ago. Thermal management suggests intentional suppression. I can't classify the M profile. A longer pause this time. Send me the data. Mara sent it. The pause that followed was different from the first 2. This was the pause of someone looking at something and not immediately knowing what to say about it. Voss Chen's voice had changed. Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was the TSC's designation for a potential first contact situation with an unclassified species. It required the survey team to hold position, activate full sensor logging, and transmit an emergency burst to TSC command with all available data. It did not require evacuation, but it also didn't prohibit it. Understood, Mara said. I'm initiating the burst transmission now. Dr. Chen, your team should consider. I know, Chen said. We're running the evaluation. Give me 10 minutes. 8 minutes later, before Chen called back, the 2 signatures at 300 kilometers became 9 signatures at 240 kilometers, moving on an intercept vector towards survey platform Kilo 7. And then the Ardennes primary communications array went dark. It didn't fail. It didn't break. There was no damage, no blown component, no cascading fault. It simply stopped receiving and transmitting, as though something outside had reached in and turned it off. Mara had spent 11 years in space, and she had seen many kinds of equipment failure, and this was not any of them. She stood alone in the operations bay of the Ardennes, the ship creaking gently around her. 9 unknown signatures closing on a trajectory that would bring them past her and to the survey platform in approximately 37 minutes, and she was completely cut off from everyone she knew. She thought about the unfinished message to Anise. Then she thought about what she was going to do. The first thing Mara did was exactly what she had been trained to do, and it failed with a completeness that was almost elegant. Protocol 7 called for a specific sequence. Secure all sensor data. Prepare an emergency burst transmission using the backup communication system, and initiate a passive holding pattern. No aggressive maneuvers, no active targeting, nothing that could be interpreted as threatening. The philosophy behind it was simple and had been agreed upon by all 7 spacefaring species in the compact. Unknown contact situations were more often misunderstanding than aggression, and most misunderstandings could be resolved if everyone kept their hands visible. Mara believed in this. She had sat through the training, read the case studies, seen the data on how contact scenarios played out when the standard protocols were followed. She was not a xenophobe. She was not, as she thought of it, the kind of person who shot first. She had spent her career in the business of careful, methodical, patient problem-solving. She brought the backup communications array online, a secondary system, less powerful than the primary but built on different hardware and using a different transmission band, specifically for contingencies. She composed a compact emergency burst: position, sensor readings, the timeline of events, the communication blackout. She addressed it to TSC command on the standard emergency frequency and sent it. Nothing. Not a transmission failure on her end. The system reported a clean send, but she had no way to know if it had reached anyone, because the confirmation protocol, the automated acknowledgement that told you the message had been received and logged, never came back. Whatever was suppressing the Ardennes communications was apparently not limited to one band. She tried the third option: a tight beam optical transmission, a narrow laser pulse carrying a compressed data packet, pointed at the general direction of the inner system, relays 60 light-minutes away. The optical array confirmed transmission. She would have no way to know if it worked for at least 2 hours, which was how long a signal would take to reach the relay and return an acknowledgement. She didn't have 2 hours. The 9 signatures had become 13. They were moving in a formation she'd never seen catalogued, not a combat spread, not a transit formation, something more like a net being drawn tighter. 2 of the signatures had split from the main group and were moving on a separate vector that, when Mara plotted it out, would take them around to the far side of the survey platform, cutting off any exit back into clear space. She was watching something that understood tactics. The Ardennes had, as noted in its procurement doc, Humantation, a deterrent-class defensive suite. This meant 2 things: a point defense system capable of intercepting incoming projectiles and basic energy discharges, and a single forward-facing directed energy weapon that was officially designated as a navigational hazard clearance tool and unofficially known, by everyone who had ever served on a Type 7 platform tender, as the rock gun it was designed to break up small debris fields. Its effective range against a hardened target was approximately 2 kilometers. The closest incoming signature was 220 kilometers out. She ran the engagement calculations anyway. It took approximately 4 seconds for the ship's tactical computer to return what amounted to a polite mathematical notification that she had no viable offensive options. What she had were maneuver options. The Ardennes could move. Not quickly, not gracefully, but it could move, and in space, distance was a form of survival. She plotted a course that would take the ship away from the platform and into a higher density region of the nebula's outer edge, not into the nebula itself, but close enough to it that sensor-based tracking would be degraded. She executed the maneuver. The Ardennes began its ponderous turn, thrusters firing in sequence, the ship groaning softly in the way it did when asked to do anything other than hold still. 3 of the signatures immediately altered course to match her new vector. They knew where she was going before she got there. Either they had sensor capabilities that made her maneuver irrelevant, or they had made a prediction about her behavior and were acting on it. Neither possibility was comforting. She stopped the maneuver. Continuing it would simply draw those 3 signatures directly toward her while the others continued to the platform. She was not, she realized, going to outrun or outmaneuver 13 ships with a Type 7 tender. That avenue was closed. She sat down at the navigation console and made herself breathe for a moment. What do you know, she thought. What do you actually know? She knew 13 ships had emerged from inside the Vanthari Nebula, which meant they lived there or operated from there, and every other spacefaring species in the compact had decided the best policy was to leave them alone in it. She knew they had cut communications first before doing anything else, which meant either they feared communication or they feared it being recorded and transmitted. She knew they had not yet fired on anything. They were maneuvering aggressively, but they hadn't shot. That was not nothing. That was possibly information. She knew the survey platform had a crew of 8 people, Dr. Chen and 7 researchers, none of them military, none of them combat trained, stationed there to study nebula boundary formation. The platform had no defensive capability at all and extremely limited maneuver capacity. It was, essentially, a box. She had to do something. The trained responses had been tried and had failed. The logical tactical options had been evaluated and dismissed. She was sitting in a very large, very slow ship with a water pistol for a weapon, 13 unknowns closing on a course that would take them past her, and to 8 people who couldn't move, and she had no communications with anyone who could help. It was in this state, not quite panic, something colder and more focused than panic, that Mara found herself thinking about her father's garage. She had been 14 years old. This was before he got sick, while he was still the person she thought of as her father rather than the person who became her father toward the end, the diminished, quiet man who had needed things she didn't know how to provide. This was the version of him who wore the same gray work shirt every weekend and kept an immaculate set of tools on a pegboard above his workbench and had a theory about everything. There was a wasp nest in the far corner of the garage. A big one. She remembered it as the size of a football, though her adult memory knew this was probably exaggerated. Her father had discovered it on a Sunday afternoon in September and stood in front of it for a long time, the way he stood in front of problems, with his hands on his hips and his head slightly to one side. "Can't just spray it," he'd said. "They'll come straight at you." He'd thought about it for another minute. "Can't burn it." A pause. "Can't knock it down and run there faster." He'd turned to her and she'd expected him to say they'd have to call someone, get an exterminator. Instead he'd said, "What does a wasp respond to that isn't a direct threat?" She'd been 14. She'd said she didn't know. "Nothing," he'd said. "Wasps only respond to direct threats. So you take away the thing you're protecting and then a wasp nest is just a wasp nest." He'd spent 20 minutes very carefully moving everything valuable out of the corner of the garage. His good drill, a set of car burette components he'd been rebuilding, her bicycle. Then he'd simply left that corner alone. Over the following weeks, without a direct threat to respond to, the nest had been abandoned. The wasps had moved. The problem had resolved itself. She sat in the operations bay of the Ardennes and thought about that story for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened the comm channel to Kilo 7. There was static. Whatever was suppressing local communications was imperfect at close range. She realized, because the platform was only 12 kilometers away, and she was getting a degraded but functional signal. She didn't say it as a question. The channel was being compressed to almost nothing by interference, but she could hear breathing on the other end. "Chen, I need you to listen to me and then do exactly what I say, and I need you to do it right now." A burst of static, then Chen's voice strained. "Voss, there. I know, I need you to prepare for emergency platform separation. All non-essential personnel in the lifeboat module. Take everything you've recorded, get it in the secure cache, seal it. I need the platform to look empty." A pause. "Vice, the protocol is." "The protocol assumes we can communicate for help. We can't. I need the platform to look abandoned. I need those ships to be approaching something that isn't worth approaching. Do you understand me?" Another pause. Longer. Chen was a scientist. Scientists were not typically in favor of abandoning their workstations based on the instincts of a systems engineer. "I understand you," Chen said finally, "but you should know they've already targeted the platform. I can see the targeting profiles on our sensor skin. Voss, if they fire." "I know," Mara said, "which is why I'm going to give them a better target." That was the decision. She made it quietly, without drama, sitting alone in her ship with the ventilation cycling and the coffee ghost in the air. She made it the way she made all decisions, by looking at the shape of the problem until she could see where the stress was going, and then putting herself in the path of it. Everyone who knew her well enough to understand what she was proposing would have called it suicidal. She thought it probably wasn't. She thought there was a way through. She thought this the way you think things when you're trying very hard not to think about your daughter, and an unfinished message, and a blue sweater that used to be yours. The plan depended on 4 things being true, and Mara had verified only 2 of them. The first was that the unknowns, whatever they were, had emerged from inside the Vanthari Nebula. This was verified. She had the sensor logs. The second was that they had suppressed their thermal signatures, which required active management running a cooling system that was countering the heat output of their propulsion. This was verified. She had the data. The third was an inference, that something about the outside of the nebula was threatening to them, or at minimum unfamiliar. Every species that had encountered them had been running away from the nebula when the pursuit occurred. No one had ever tested what happened if you ran toward it. The fourth was a technical question she couldn't fully answer in advance. Whether the Ardennes' environmental systems, pushed well beyond their design parameters, could produce an effect large enough to matter at range. She started running numbers. The Ardennes was a habitat platform tender. Its primary job was to support and resupply remote stations, which meant it carried a great deal of what those stations needed: atmosphere, water, power generation equipment, and in particular a substantial inventory of the compressed gas mixtures used to refresh station atmospheres after extended operations. Platform tenders were, in effect, large airtight trucks carrying enormous quantities of carefully managed environmental resources. The Vanthari Nebula was, among other things, a region of extremely high ambient electromagnetic radiation and complex magnetic field interactions. Sensors didn't work well in it. Thermal signatures were masked by the environment. It was, essentially, a very large version of the kind of electromagnetic interference that made GPS unreliable near certain industrial facilities. If you pumped a very large quantity of ionized atmosphere into the space between two ships, and if that atmosphere was already charged with a conductive medium, and if you did it in a region of space where the background M environment was complex, you got noise. You got a local approximation of the nebula's outer interference layer. Not the nebula itself. Nothing she could do would replicate 4 light-years of stellar nursery, but possibly enough to degrade their sensor capabilities, mask the Ardennes' own signature, and most critically, disrupt whatever communications they were using between their own ships. The formation she'd been watching depended on coordinate. Ion, 13 ships moving in a net pattern required them to talk to each other. If she could interrupt that conversation even briefly, the net became disorganized. And a disorganized enemy was an enemy that had to reorient before it could act. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a defense. It was, in the most literal sense possible, a smoke screen. She began the preparation at 14:22 ship time, working methodically through the ship systems the way she had worked through systems for 11 years. Not with urgency, but with the particular focused efficiency that came from knowing exactly what you were doing and why each step mattered. First, she redistributed power from the weapons and navigation systems she wasn't using either effectively anyway to the environmental management array and the external venting systems. The Ardennes had 18 external venting ports, designed for controlled atmosphere release during station resupply operations. She brought all 18 online, overrode the standard safety governors that prevented high-volume simultaneous discharge, and connected them to the main atmosphere storage tanks. The safety governor override required her to manually authorize the action at 3 separate terminals, which was the system's way of making very certain that whoever was doing this understood they were doing something that the engineers who designed it had specifically tried to prevent. She authorized it at each terminal. Second, she accessed the inventory of specialized gas mixtures in storage. Platform tenders carried, among other things, quantities of atmosphere-forming gases in various compositions, including a substantial reserve of ionized plasma buffer, compounds, a component used in certain atmospheric processors that had a very low electrical resistance and a high tendency to ionize further when exposed to ambient radiation. It was used in normal operations, in extremely small quantities. Myra prepared to use all of it. Third, She brought the ship's secondary reactor to maximum output. This was not, strictly speaking, recommended for a Type 7 platform tender operating in a high-radiation environment. The reactor's safety systems objected loudly. She overrode them, which required a physical key from a lockbox bolted to the wall beneath her bunk, and she stood in her cabin for a moment holding the key, which was orange-handled and had a scratch on it from when she dropped it during a drill 4 years ago, and she thought, this is the part where it could go very wrong. She went back to the operations bay and turned the secondary reactor up. The Ardennes began making a new sound, a low, resonant harmonics that she felt in her back teeth more than heard. The ship was running hotter than it had ever run in her experience of it. She pulled up the thermal management systems and watched the numbers climb. Her hands were steady. She was mildly surprised by this. At 14:51, she opened the Kilo 7 channel again. The signal was worse now, compressed almost to unintelligibility by the increasing electromagnetic activity of the reactor. She got Chen's voice in fragments. Personnel in the module, we're. Chen, she kept her voice flat. In approximately 8 minutes I am going to need the platform to go completely dark. 0 emissions, everything off. Can you do that? A long burst of static. Then do it, but Voss, what are you? I'm going to get their attention, she said, and then I'm going to make it very hard for them to act on it. Get in the module, close the hatch. Don't come out for at least 2 hours regardless of what you see on external sensors. She didn't wait for a response. The channel was barely functional anyway. At 15:02, she fired all 18 venting ports simultaneously. The effect was, from inside the Ardennes, almost anticlimactic. A series of deep thuds, the ports cycling open, the compressed gases beginning their discharge, and then a hiss that built into a sustained roar that she felt through the deck plating. The ship shook. Not catastrophically, not structurally, but the way a ship shakes when something significant is happening to it. The thermal management alarms began their cascade. The discharge was accelerating heat buildup in the hull systems, because she had redirected the cooling capacity to the venting array, and the hull was now beginning to cook in its own emissions. She had approximately 20 minutes before the hull temperature reached a point that would become a hull integrity problem. Outside, invisible to her direct observation, and visible only through the increasingly distorted sensor array, the Ardennes was becoming a small star. The ionized buffer compound, released in quantity and immediately irradiated by the elevated output of the secondary reactor, began to form a spreading cloud of electrostatically charged particles. The high radiation environment at the nebula's edge was doing exactly what she'd predicted, stripping electrons, building RGE differentials, creating a local electromagnetic environment that was a poor man's version of the nebula itself. Her own sensors began returning false contacts. Interference patterns bloomed across every display. If her sensors were affected, theirs were affected. She watched through noise and static, and the increasingly alarming thermal displays the formation begin to change. It happened slowly at first. 2 of the signatures near the platform altered course slightly, what looked like a correction. Then a third. Then, unmistakably, the tight net formation that had been converging on Kilo 7 began to dissolve not into chaos, but into the kind of deliberate, careful reformation that a skilled formation makes when its coordination has been disrupted. They were intelligent. They were adapting. But adaptation took time. She had 12 minutes before the hull became a problem. She used 3 of them watching the formation adapt, cataloging what she could see through the interference, trying to understand the shape of their response. They were pulling back toward each other, tightening the formation rather than spreading. This was, she thought, the behavior of a group that had lost confidence in its sensor picture and was defaulting to visual or short-range contact. The Ardennes was currently producing an electromagnetic and thermal signature that was, at close range, essentially indistinguishable from a small nebular boundary event. She was not hidden, but she was confusing. 11 minutes. The formation had stopped advancing toward Kilo 7. That was the thing she needed. The wasps were not ignoring her, she was clearly their new point of focus, and 3 of the signatures had begun a cautious approach toward her position, but the platform was, for the moment, not the target. She needed to give Chen's people time to get into the lifeboat module. She needed to give the optical transmission she'd sent 2 hours ago time to reach the relay and propagate to TSC command. She needed to survive long enough to be still there when whoever command sent eventually arrived. 9 minutes. The thermal alarms were insistent now. The hull temperature was reading numbers she had never seen on an operational vessel. She began the second phase of the plan, which was the part she was least confident about. The Ardennes had, in its standard equipment inventory, a set of modular beacon arrays. These were simple devices, powerful transmitters designed to mark a location for incoming vessels, basic navigation aids, nothing sophisticated. They were normally deployed from a small airlock on the ship's port side and left to drift in the vicinity of a station to guide approaching ships. She had deployed them all already, in the 20 minutes while she was preparing the gas discharge 5 beacons, spread in a rough arc between the Ardennes and the incoming formation. She had programmed each one with a specific M emission pattern that was, individually, meaningless. Together, the 5 beacons were generating a structured interference pattern, a kind of electronic fence, that she was broadcasting on the frequency profile most closely associated with the Vanthari's own natural emission signature. It was not a weapon. It was not a warning. It was a message of sorts, not in words, not in any language, but in the universal language of this place is dangerous and I am part of it. The beacons were telling the incoming ships, in the only signal she had available, the boundary has moved. She had no idea if they would understand it that way. 7 minutes. The 3 approaching signatures slowed. Not stopped, slowed, and altered their approach angle in a way that suggested they were processing something, recalculating. She could see, on her increasingly noise-degraded sensors, the other 10 signatures holding their position. The formation was watching. Come on, she thought, not directed at anyone in particular, just the general human habit of talking to the universe when the universe had you by the throat. 5 minutes. Hull temperature in the forward section was approaching a threshold she'd been trained to treat as irreversible. The structural integrity systems were throwing faults in 2 locations. She had to begin cooling down, which meant reducing the reactor output, which meant reducing the emissions cloud, which meant something happened at the outer edge of her sensor range that changed everything. A new signature, large, moving at a speed that was not possible under any propulsion system Mara was aware of, coming from the direction of the inner relay, which was 60 light-minutes away. 60 light-minutes was 93 minutes of emergency transit at maximum rated speed for a TSC response vessel. 93 minutes. It had been 91 minutes since she sent the optical transmission. She stared at the sensor return for a long moment, trying to make sense of it through the interference. Too large for a response vessel. Too fast. And the M profile was she had seen that profile before, not in TSC databases, but in the xenobiology reference materials she'd been given at the start of this deployment. Because being stationed near the Vanthari Nebula meant you got a briefing on every species that had ever been logged in this region, including the species the TSC had an auxiliary cooperation agreement with. The profile matched S-Sori deep range craft. She had not contacted the S-Sori. She had no mechanism to contact the S-Sori. But the Vanthari Nebula was in a region of space the S-Sori had designated an exclusion zone, and evidently they monitored it. Evidently, the emergence of 13 unknown ships from it was exactly the kind of event their monitoring was designed to detect. Evidently, they had already been in transit when she sent her optical burst, and whatever signal she'd sent had helped them fix her location. Or perhaps they had been watching the Ardennes since it arrived. That was, she thought, also possible. 3 minutes. She began reducing the reactor output. The incoming formation, all 13 signatures, had now seen the S-Sori vessel. She watched, through the clearing interference, as her emissions cloud began to disperse, as the formation executed a maneuver that she could only describe as a controlled withdrawal. Not a rout, not a panic, a deliberate, organized retreat back toward the Nebula boundary. They were going home. She stood at the sensor station, her hands bracing herself against the console as the Ardennes creaked and shuddered in the thermal aftermath of what she had done to it, and she watched 13 ships slip back through the Nebula boundary and disappear into the cloud. The last one paused at the boundary for approximately 45 seconds. She had no way to know what it was doing. She had no way to read its communications, no way to see its crew or its interior, no way to know what it thought of the single human in a Type 7 platform tender who had lit herself on fire and stood in the doorway. Then it was gone. The hull integrity alert in the forward section was now the loudest sound in the operations bay. The hull didn't breach. This was the first good thing. The forward section took structural damage, 2 interconnected compartments, both non-critical, both now sealed behind emergency bulkheads. The environmental system for the forward quarter of the ship would need complete replacement. The ionized discharge had worked its way back through the porting system and contaminated the atmospheric processing equipment in a way that the diagnostics described, with admirable precision. As non-recoverable, the secondary reactor had sustained damage to its magnetic containment assembly that had not yet become a problem, but would become one within approximately 16 hours, meaning she had 16 hours to either repair it or shut it down, and she couldn't repair it with what she had. The sensor array was partially functional. The communication system's primary and secondary were still dark, and she was beginning to understand that whatever the formation had done to suppress them had not simply been disrupted, but had been applied in a way that was intended to last. The hardware was intact. The signals were being absorbed somewhere between the antenna and the carrier wave, an effect she had never seen before and had no framework for explaining. She began writing it up anyway, in the ship's technical log, because that was what you did. The S-Sori vessel held position at 600 kilometers and made no attempt to communicate with the Ardennes for 4 hours. Mara noted this with interest. She was aware that S-Sori communication protocols were significantly different from human protocols, and that what might read as silence or indifference on a human timescale was often, for the S-Sori, simply a different pace of consideration. She had read the xenobiology briefings. She was not offended. She used the 4 hours to assess the secondary reactor situation, to run a full survey of the structural damage, and to begin the painstaking process of trying to restore at least the short-range communication capability. She also heated water for coffee and drank 2 cups, standing at the galley counter, looking out the one porthole on the Ardennes that offered a clear view of the nebula. It looked the same as it had looked before, dense, luminous, ancient. The gas clouds moved on timescales too long for human observation, so it looked still a painting of a storm rather than the storm itself. Somewhere inside it, 13 ships were doing whatever they did when they were not approaching survey platforms and cutting communications and forming tactical nets around things that couldn't run. She thought about the one that had paused at the boundary. She would never know what that meant. That was one of the things she was already coming to terms with, the irreducible fact that she had been in the middle of something enormous and she had understood almost none of it, and she never would. She had done something, and something had responded to it, and the shape of what had happened between those two things was invisible to her. Maybe it always would be. The S-Sori vessel finally established contact at the 4-hour mark, using a communication protocol that the Ardennes system struggled with before managing a basic translation matrix. The message was formal, highly compressed, and conveyed the following, approximately. Vessel Terran registered. Your signal received. Situation is noted. You will be resupplied and your crew will be evacuated. We have questions. She sent back, crew is at survey platform Kilo 7. 8 personnel, platform intact. I have technical damage, secondary reactor integrity 16 hours. No casualties. A pause of 20 minutes, then confirmed. One question now, you did not retreat. She stared at that for a while. She thought about how to answer it, and she decided that honest was probably best. She sent back, I had people here I couldn't leave. Another pause, longer this time 40 minutes. Then, understood. This explains many things humans have done that we did not understand before. She was still thinking about that response when, 11 minutes later, a TSC emergency vessel came out of transit at 60,000 kilometers and began broadcasting on the emergency frequency, and her communications block lifted as suddenly as it had descended, and every channel she had simultaneously filled with voices, and the world flooded back in. The debrief took 9 days, conducted partly aboard the TSC vessel Constant, and partly on a temporary joint facility that was established for the purpose a thing that had never happened before. A shared space where TSC personnel and SRI envoys sat in the same room and talked about the same event from their respective understandings of it. Mara participated in 12 hours of formal debrief sessions and wrote a 70-page technical report and submitted her sensor logs, technical logs, and personal log to both organizations. She answered every question she was asked with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything else. She slept badly for the first 4 days and then, abruptly, very well. Dr. Chen came to find her on the 3rd day. She looked like she had not slept at all. I need to tell you something, Chen said. She was sitting across from Mara in the small common area of the Constant, holding a coffee she wasn't drinking. When you told us to go dark, I almost didn't. I thought she stopped. I thought you were making a mistake. I thought the right thing was to try to communicate directly, to try to establish contact. It might have worked, Mara said. It might have, Chen agreed. But it didn't need to because you gave us time. She paused. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you and I can't find it. You don't have to find it, Mara said. No, I do. Chen looked at her. You ran your ship into that situation on purpose. You know that's. I know what it is, Mara said. Silence between them, the comfortable kind that takes time to earn. The SRI told the envoy something, Chen said after a while. They told him that the entities in the Vanthari, they don't have a name for them. They have a designation, something like the ones who predate the naming, that they've emerged before. Several times over several centuries. Every time whatever ships were present retreated. The SRI concluded they were territorial, that they would pursue anything that entered the outer boundary and retreat when it left. It was a stable arrangement. Leave them alone, they leave you alone. Until we set up a survey platform right on the edge, Mara said. Until we set up a survey platform right on the edge, Chen confirmed. The SRI had been monitoring. This is how the envoy put it, they were anticipating an incident. They had a vessel in the region already. She paused. They weren't coming to rescue us. They were coming to watch. Mara thought about that. What changed? Your optical burst. They moved to intercept before they received it. They were already responding to the emergence event. But when they received your signal, they altered their approach. They came to your position instead of the platform. Chen set down her coffee. The envoy said something I keep thinking about. He said that the entities from the Vanthari had never encountered anything that didn't move away from them. They didn't have a protocol for something that moved toward them. They didn't know what it meant to pause. He said that might be why they stopped, not because they were afraid, because his word was uncertain. Myra looked out the viewport at the stars, the ordinary ones, the ones that were just stars. My father used to say that confidence is mostly about knowing what you're not afraid of, she said. He was talky. NG about wasps. Chen looked at her. What? It doesn't matter, Mara almost smiled. It made sense when I thought it. The Ardennes was assessed as repairable. The forward section damage was significant, and the environmental systems required complete replacement, and the secondary reactor needed a maintenance overhaul that would take 6 weeks in a proper facility. The communication suppression had lifted, and the systems checked out as intact but would need full recertification. The insurance claim, which Mara filed in the same methodical way she filed everything, ran to a number that caused a human resources officer at TSC to call her directly and ask, very carefully, whether she had considered the alternatives. She said she had considered them. She said the Ardennes was still in one piece and so were 9 people. The human resources officer said yes, that was true, and closed the call. The formal commendation came 6 weeks later and said nothing particularly personal. Mara filed it with her other professional documents. What stayed with her was not the commendation. What stayed with her was a message from the SRI envoy, not an official communication, but a personal one, sent through the diplomatic channel with a note that it was intended for her specifically and not for institutional record. It said in translation, "We have observed your species for 41 of your years. In that time, we have tried to understand what makes you different from the other species we know. We have proposed many theories. The one that has been most persistent among our analysts is that you do not always know when something is impossible. This has seemed to us a deficiency. After the Vanthari event, several of our analysts have revised their assessment. We are uncertain whether it is a deficiency or an advantage. Perhaps it is both. We thought you should know that this question is now under active discussion. This is not nothing among the SRI." She read it twice, and then she sat with it for a while. 6 weeks after the event, the Ardennes was in a maintenance dock at Relay Station Farspoke. Mara had been given a standard post-incident leave period, which she was spending in the station's minimal but functional habitat ring, sleeping in a small room that smelled of recycled air and industrial solvent, eating in a canteen that had 3 options, and one of them was always some variation of reconstituted rice, and doing very little. She called Inez on the 2nd day. Inez knew the broad outline of what had happened. It had made a certain kind of news, not the dramatic splashy kind but the specialist audience kind, the kind that people in xenobiology and Survey Corps work read carefully. She had sent 3 messages to the Ardennes before the communications blackout lifted, all of them starting with her name and a question mark. After the blackout lifted, the messages had been waiting. Inez looked like herself on the screen. The blue sweater was not in evidence. She was wearing something green, a color she'd apparently decided suited her recently. She looked tired and fierce and worried in a way she was working hard to not show, which was something she had gotten, Mara thought, from her father, not from her. "I want you to tell me all of it," Inez said, "not the official version, the actual version." "The official version is the actual version," Mara said. "I'm constitutionally incapable of filing an inaccurate report." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Inez leaned toward the camera. "I mean what you were thinking, what it was like." Mara thought about how to answer that. She thought about the smell of the Ardennes and her father's garage and a wasp nest the size of a football. She thought about 13 ships that had never encountered something that didn't run away. She thought about the SRI envoy's message and the phrase "this is not nothing" among the SRI. "I was thinking about an unfinished message," she said. "I was thinking I wanted to finish it." Inez looked at her for a long moment. "What was the message?" "It was to you." Mara paused. "About your thesis framing. I had a thought." "Tell me," Inez said. So she did. They talked for an hour and a half about the thesis, about the panel, about the professor who didn't take her seriously. Mara's thought was good, and Inez said so, in the particular way she had of confirming things she already half knew but needed to hear aloud. Outside the small window of Mara's room, the maintenance dock was lit with the ordinary yellow light of working lights, practical and unglamorous, the light of things being fixed. After the call ended, Mara sat in the quiet room and thought about what had happened, not the tactics of it, not the technical decisions, not the diplomatic aftermath. Just the essential fact of it. There had been a thing in the dark that had never found anything that didn't run, and she had run toward it instead, not because she was brave, not because she was reckless, not because she didn't understand what it was, but because there were 8 people on a platform 12 kilometers away, and the message to her daughter was unfinished, and some part of her had simply decided that those facts outweighed the other facts. She didn't know what the Sari would conclude about that. She didn't know what the things in the nebula had made of her. She knew what she made of it. This, she thought, is what we are, not the part where we win, the part where we can't think of a reason good enough to stop. She turned off the light. Outside, the nebula was 400 light-years away, and older than language and full of things that had never met anything that didn't flinch. She slept.